guess the latency is also spread a little bit into the timetable, so we need to move forward. If I can get Jeff Finkelstein up onto the stage from Cox Communications. Jeff is the Executive Director of Strategic Architecture there, and has also got a new role of being responsible for future network planning, so it'd be interesting to hear from the US perspective. Thanks, Jeff.
So, there we go. So you've been sitting there for quite a while. So I'm going to take you to the more interactive part of the program. And just to get the mental synapses firing, start with a very simple attempt at humor. So how many folks would consider themselves engineers in the room? Okay, then it might be worth telling you. So what's the difference between an introverted engineer and an extroverted engineer? Any takers? Okay, an extrovert engineer looks at your shoes. So what I'm going to talk about is so my role at Cox and Bit and Cable. Let me go back, set the Wayback Machine to about 1995. Bit and Cable about 22 years. Have been involved in every version of DOCSIS and even pre-DOCSIS. So I'm typically a physical layer kind of person, backgrounds in physics, among other things. But lately I've been looking at Mac layer stuff. And I'm going to start out really high level, and then we're going to kind of deep dive into some more technical details, hopefully not too technical. So I'm going to start with the punchline. You're reading the last page of the book first. Surprise, it was Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick. And in the average operator's financials, about 85% of our CapEx we spend in the access network, which is, so I break the network into 5 layers. Top layer is the backbone, peering points, interconnects. Metro, I call it the edge serving facility, the MTC, main transmission center. Some people call it a central office, outside plant, and customer premise. So it's the last 3, edge, outside plant, and customer premise, that really is where that big spend is. Now, the way we provide capacity to customers is we share bandwidth. That I spent a lot of time in the early 2000s looking at the innards of the cable equipment and some of the fiber equipment, because we've been deploying GPON since about 2006. And what we do is we typically run at about a 5% concurrency. Meaning that you have 100 customers, 5% of them will be active, or 5 will be active at any point in time simultaneously using the network. So that's how we engineer our networks. For the access network, we plan for that optimal quality of experience during peak hours, which in the US is 7 to 10 p.m., or applying my European translator to that is still 7 to 10 p.m. Now, the way we do this in the cable space is we add carriers. In the old days, and I don't see that much gray hair in the room, or lack of hair like myself. We started this, and if you set the Wayback Machine again to the mid-90s, we were deploying COM21 Land City, Motorola CDLP modems and devices, and we had a single downstream carrier running at 64 QAM and a single upstream carrier running at QPSK, which means you had about 20 megabits per second downstream and around 10 megabits per second upstream. And we provided that to over 2,000 households passed. And customers looked at it and they declared it as good. But then things started happening. This gentleman in Switzerland, Tim Berners-Lee, created the World Wide Web. and I think you know the story from there. So we needed to do new things. As part of the DOCSIS evolution, we went from DOCSIS 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0 to 3.1 and on. So we're adding more and more capacity because the bottom line is it comes down to the ubiquity of the services we provide. Whereas, as some of the earlier speakers said, it really doesn't matter what the delivery medium is. And just one, I'm going to drop all kinds of pearls of wisdom here that come with age. And one of them is, just always keep it in mind, when you go to a surgeon, don't be surprised when the advice involves surgery. So when you go to somebody for advice, you need to always take into account where that person is coming from, and keep in mind what problems you're trying to solve. Because it's very easy to get so caught up in technology, and it's so exciting because, after all, some of us are introvert and others are extrovert engineers. But it comes down to a business problem. And Bruno had a great quote earlier, which is of course on my notepad. But it was basically that, and Steve had kind of danced around it as well, that customers don't really buy technologies. And the way I like to say it is, customers want ice cubes. They don't care about refrigerators. That we've been in a world of mutually assured destruction, with trying to one-up each other, adding more and more capacity. If somebody offers 10 megabits, somebody else would offer 11 megabits, then 12, then 13, 14. What do you do in a gigabit world, in the gigasphere? Those incremental changes are meaningless because customers don't care about the refrigerators. What customers buy are services. That is our responsibility now to meet those services. That requires a fiber deep strategy. So, 3 key points that I make with our network strategy. One is we want a winning network, which means fiber deep, because that is what moves us to any of the future paths that occur. That once you have that fiber deep, you can do all sorts of interesting things. So full duplex DOCSIS is a great example. That it gives us the ability to in some semblance, simulate full duplex capabilities over a coaxial-based network using DOCSIS. There's other ways of doing it. It requires what we call passive coax, meaning no actives. Some call it node plus 0. But to get there, you need fiber deep. Fiber to the home. We do quite a bit of fiber to the home at Cox. And to get there, we need that fiber deep. Because a great piece of advice is, don't wait for somebody to overbuild you, overbuild yourself. And then your options are dramatic for what you can do going forward. Or providing 5G services, whether you provide it yourself, it's an MVNO, it's a front haul, back haul. Again, fiber is important. 5G has very strong latency requirements, slightly better than what you can get with this clicker. Now, having that fiber deep means that you can now achieve this ubiquity. So this is obviously a map of the states, and these are all of our markets. The blue ones are where we're going to be using DOCSIS 3.1 for that ubiquitous gigabit symmetrical type experiences. And then we have some targeted fiber to the home gigabit regions. And in either scenario, the network designs are the same. We're not pulling fiber from the edge facilities, the CO, to the node. We're pulling it from the node to the customer. Not always going directly to the customer, but we have enough there that we can do it. A key point that we have to remember is strategically, right? We are not the world contrary to Michael Jackson's song. We're only a player in it. And it's important that we partner with each other as service providers, whether we're cable or telco or wireless. Because to get there, you have to achieve scale, right? And regardless of what others say, commoditization is not innovation. That commoditization can drive pricing down, but it's not innovative. Virtualization is not innovation in itself. It's what you do with it. So you need to be very strategic in what you are using to provide the services. Because I firmly believe that DOCSIS 3.1, we know, is very capable of providing significant amounts of bandwidth. And how we use that bandwidth, along with our fiber deep, gives us an incredible amount of capabilities in the coax network. Right? Coax has a long and very useful life ahead of it. So some real quick basics. You get a big pipe, you slice that up into multiple customers accessing it, and that total bandwidth is basically, the average per sub is how much you have and how much each uses, and service groups. Not going to dwell on this too much. Bottom picture kind of gives a spectrum layout. So an important point is spectrum is free to the great architect of the universe. But as service providers, we have to pay for it. And we need to optimize every bit per second per hertz that we possibly can. And as all the engineers know, as you get to higher order modulations, your gain for what it costs for the amount of power, heating, cooling, equipment space goes down dramatically. Because there are many laws we can break, the laws of physics are not one of them. And while we try to follow the Moore curve, the reality is that there are two other ones that get in the way. Very geeky type stuff, but one is called CUMI, which deals with, as you shrink silicon down, the amount of work, energy, joules, takes up a lot of space, and it generates heat. You have to dissipate the heat. Denard's the other one, and these both deal with, you shrink silicon, the amount of heat it takes, the amount of energy may decrease, but the amount it generates, etc. So ties into some of the virtualization discussion. Bandwidth management, we typically add carriers. We go to DOCSIS 3.1, we're going to IP video, etc. But the key point is that bottom right corner. And it's that as we drive fiber deeper, we can go from what we call node plus 5, it's a node with 5 actives, to a node with 1 active to a node with 0 actives. But every time you do this, it's almost an order of magnitude in the amount of equipment it takes in the edge facilities to provide those services to customers. So you very rapidly, as these things scale, when you go from 1 node, which becomes somewhere around 14 nodes, that's 14 times the amount of equipment. So we need ways to manage that scale. Virtualization is one way, but it's not the only way. So what's using it? Not going to get into any of the really details on this, but let's suffice that there's 3 lines on that curve. The blue line at a compound annual growth rate of 49% is historically what's been going on since I've been tracking it since about 1982. The yellow line is what our financial people want us to develop, or we want us to use as our spend to meet the compound annual growth of 49%. The green line in the middle is what we negotiated. And the interesting thing is that when you look at it, because it's an asymptote, those first 3 years, it doesn't matter what the growth rate is. Over 5 years, it starts mattering. But a key point is that if you look closely, and it ties into what Ronan had said and what Steve said and Bruno, basically in any projection we've run, every model we've run, any model I've seen run, in 2027, typical home worldwide will consume about 50 megabits per second at peak hour, which is about 2 4K TVs, 2 HDs, and a bunch of other equipment, Internet of Things, etc. So you can take that and use that to calculate how much bandwidth you need in that entire serving area, regardless of what your delivery technology is. You can see what's using it. You know, we've seen these things many times. That's a virtual clicker. Thank you. So this is the roadmap. And one of the key sayings that I use is, I like to separate regrettable spend from non-regrettable spend. There are things that we do that we may be a short-term problem that we have to solve. That's money that we may have to spend again because we're waiting on technology to catch up. x86 silicon cycle, 18 to 24 months. DOCSIS silicon cycle, 5 years. So while we may want things to come in sooner, and while we may, declare success when we produce specs, we still need silicon. We need integrators to take that silicon and build us gadgets. And then we need the ability to test that in our labs and integrate it. So, it's back. The remote's over here, so I'm not touching it. So, if there was an image on the screen, it wouldn't be that one image. That in the column where it addresses speeds and feeds. We're starting at the beginning with DOCSIS 2.0, where we had, again, that single downstream and a single upstream carrier. We have the second tier, where we made the move to DOCSIS 3.0. So at Cox, my responsibility for my first 10 years was deploying DOCSIS. So I came in, we basically had nothing, and then I had the team to deploy that. And we deployed that nationwide, but we did use edge cloms. We used modular CMTS. That gave us a certain amount of capacity, but in 2006, as we started doing this, I also had another project I started where we basically built out our plant to a gigahertz. And can we go back to the previous slide? There we go. Virtual clicker's working again. So the third one, we're now doing DOCSIS 3.1. An important point is, at Cox, we have 10 million households passed. We have about 12 million different DOCSIS devices in the network. We've got about 8,000 video devices, and this stuff does not go away quickly. It takes a long time. So keep that in mind, there's no quick transition unless, as Ronan said, unless you just raise the city and build a brand new city, which sounds pretty awesome, but people tend to get upset when you dig up their yard, let alone when you tear down their house. So next phase would be going from that DOCSIS 3.1 with the OFDM carriers to reclaiming spectrum with MPEG-2 to MPEG-4 conversion, which gets you effectively about 2 to 3 gigabits per second of the extra capacity just by doing that. Going to full IP delivery, getting away from legacy, increases your capacity dramatically. From there, you go to a mid-split to a high split, which is changing how much return spectrum you have from where we are today to doubling it and even 4 to 5x increase. This is where we start getting into the symmetrical gigabit type speeds. And then from there, we're already starting work with fiber all the way to the tap, a la some of the gigawire that Mr. O was talking about. We're extending the spectrum. We're looking at 3 gigahertz, which is basically about 30 gigabits per second symmetrical over a coax network. So bottom line, HFC has a long life. It's got a long useful life. It works. Leave you with some concluding thoughts. So bottom line, serendipity is not a business plan. Now, you may be saying, just tell him that he's dreaming. But you can't wait for things to change. You need to drive that change. Now, there was a great quote from the artist Andy Warhol. And what Andy said was that you can't wait for change. You have to make the change happen. And serendipity, it's great, but you cannot base a business on it. Keep things simple at the edge, whether you're in the analog or PON world to DOCSIS with remote PHY or remote MAC PHY or remote MAC core, the new technology we're working on. Keep it simple, because you don't want all of these additional management points. You need a way of controlling that in a virtualized setting. And something that was said earlier today, I think it was Steve who said it, that use the technology as long as it makes sense, but no longer. Just think back to how many times we've pushed technologies to the limit, and we've gone past that limit. And then we had our big moment, our V8 moment, and just gone, why did we do that? We create a world of hurt upon ourselves. We have to be able to quote that great philosopher Pumbaa, you have to be able to put your behind in the past and know when to give up a technology. Use it for as long as you can, but not too long. In the end, the cheapest and quickest way to go to node plus 0 is to go to node plus 0. Every step along the way is just potentially a regrettable spend, which is okay, but do it because you chose to do it, not because you didn't decide. Important point to remember when it comes to virtualization, that no amount of software written to date has generated a single photon. That virtualize what makes sense to virtualize, but don't get too carried away with it. Because the closer you get to line rate, the more you need custom ASICs. Custom silicon. So you can virtualize what I call the cognitive functions, routing and that sort of stuff. But you can't virtualize the physical layer currently. And the MAC layer, you need as close to the physical as you can to meet the timing constraints of 5G delivery. So HFCs, I believe strongly, it's got a long life, it's got a long useful life, but you have to feed it a proper diet. So if we get too carried away with trying to get it to do things that it's really not meant to do, in the end, that becomes a regrettable spend and has a significant impact because, as I said earlier, customers don't care about refrigerators, they just want ice cubes. So they buy the services, we have to get them their ice cubes, and what we do behind the scenes is optimize every dollar we possibly can and can leverage that long useful life of the coax network. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. We still have